Today, a poem and some common ground.
Welcome to Coffee with Creamer, where you get to sit down with our host, Dr. Barry Creamer, for a conversation about faith, life, and culture. We'll look at old ideas through a new lens, turn those culture wars on their head, and paint a picture of the way things could be. If you like your thinking deep and your coffee hot, pull up a chair. You're in the right place.
I have mentioned this poem actually before, The Gift Outright. We read it 160 or 70 episodes ago. So it's been 3 or 4 years, and it is a poem worth repeating. I'm not even sure I read the whole thing back then, but I want to read the whole thing to you today, and it is a beautiful poem. It's magnificent. One of Robert Frost's best and most famous poems. The Gift Outright is the name of the poem. And it is about America, and it's something he used in certain patriotic occasions. There was especially, I think, if I remember correctly, it was used at John F. Kennedy's inauguration. I believe he read it there. So anyway, the point is, I want to read the poem to you, but it's because I want to talk about something we have in common with other Americans in the context of the things we don't have in common with other Americans. So The Gift Outright, Robert Frost, here it goes, and then we'll talk through it, sort of make sure that we understand what's going on, because I understand how poetry is. I'm going to read it to you. I don't expect you to absorb the whole thing, just listening to it, first of all. If you want to look it up, I highly encourage you to do that. Read along as I'm reading through it. It might make more sense and give you an opportunity to sort of see the details of it. But then as we go through it again, reread it, so to speak, I'll sort of haggle out some of the details so that we have a grasp on what's going on in it. And then we'll make the application, talk about what it actually means. So the gift outright, what it means for us, I mean. And by that, I just mean what it means for me. And then I'm sharing it with you in the way I understand it. Obviously, poetry is just poetry. So reading it and giving it an interpretation does not mean I'm going to tell you exactly what Robert Frost meant by that. That what he meant by it was what he wrote. It's just a poem. But what I understand it to be saying, I think you will be able to share with me as we go through it. So here it is, The Gift Outright, Robert Frost. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia, but we were England's, still colonials, possessing what we still were unpossessed by what we now no more possessed. Something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, and forthwith found salvation in surrender. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. To the land, vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. That's the whole poem, quick and easy, hopefully painless. I know for some of us it's a little nerve-wracking to try to listen to poetry. But hopefully you grasped what was going on as I was reading through it. It's a description of how we became American in his way of describing it. And, in light of manifest destiny, which we probably would not agree with today as a way to understand what was happening. But in the concept of manifest destiny, it's not just here's how we became American, but here's how America became the land that we identify with and that now owns us, so to speak. So here's the poem, a phrase at a time or a sentence at a time, and then we'll just move on into what I want to talk about today. But grasp how brilliant this is. The land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. Then if you just think back to the origins of the country, we were, and he says this in a moment, we were colonialists. We belonged to England when we owned the land that was here. And regardless of what you think about colonialism and occupation and our treatment of the people who were already here and all that kind of stuff, the reality is the way we conceived of the land and our relationship with it was that we owned pieces, tracts of land, that they belonged to us. We harvested them. We took advantage of the land. And yet we did not consider ourselves Americans. We considered ourselves British. We were colonialists. So the land was ours before we were the land's. She was our land more than 100 years before we were her people. At the beginning of the 17th century, the 1600s, we already had permanent settlements here. And so he mentions those in the next line. She was ours in Massachusetts, in Virginia. Obviously, you're thinking of the first permanent settlements in the nation with Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts, and then in Virginia, Jamestown. And so we're, she's ours. We've established these plantations or this, mercantile economy. But we were England's, he goes on to say, still colonials, possessing in the land what we still were unpossessed by. It was our land. We owned it, but we weren't owned by it. We belonged to England. That's how he's writing the poem. Possessed by what we now no more possessed. And that's a reference back to our struggles with England. England owned us, but we didn't own England anymore. So here we were owning land in America, but owned by the land of England. And so England, that's sort of redundant, isn't it? Inglaterra. Something, he goes on to say, we were withholding made us weak. There was something we had not given to the land, or something we had not offered up to wherever it needed to be offered up, that kept us from being American, that kept us from being owned by the land that we owned. So something we were withholding made us weak. And this is not just wordplay. It has really powerful imagery in it that I mentioned all those weeks ago that we did this episode on it. But it's really powerful, and toward the end of the episode today, I'll return to that theme. I'll mention it to you here in just a moment. But just at this opening moment, you can see how confusing it is. Here we are living on land that's not literally England, and yet having our identity wrapped up in belonging to that island that is so far away from us now, England. So something we were withholding made us weak until we found out that it was ourselves we were withholding from our land of living, the land in which we actually lived, but also the land that provided the living for us. We were living off of this land, but identifying ourselves with a land that was thousands of miles away. So forthwith, as soon as we realized this, we were now possessed by what we no more possessed. England owned us, but we didn't have any rights in England. And so forthwith, we found salvation in surrender, which is ironic because you would think you would find salvation or deliverance in victory, in triumph. But here it's in surrender. But what are we surrendering to? And it's not the British that we're surrendering to. The whole point is that we possess land that doesn't own us. We haven't surrendered ourselves to the land is ultimately what we're going to arrive at. And so he makes the statement, forthwith found salvation in surrender, basically by rising up and not surrendering. So we protest. If we don't have representation, then why are you taxing us? And so on. So forthwith found salvation in surrender, such as we were. We gave ourselves outright, no restrictions, outright. Here, you have the deed, you own it. And the deed is the word that he uses next. So such as we were, whatever we were, this in-between state, we're sort of English but living off of the land in America, and so we don't know who we are. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright. And then I'll skip the parentheses for a second. I'll come back to it. There's a parenthetical line, but I want you to hear the line as it goes. Such as we were, we gave ourselves outright to the land. So we gave ourselves to the land, and literally, there's no compromising what that means. Ultimately, we gave ourselves to the land. We literally buried ourselves in the land. We poured our blood into it. We gave ourselves to the land the same way we had been taking from the land before. And in that cycle of production, When I was talking about Hannah Arendt and the three things that human beings actually participate in, production, reproduction, that whole laboring human is the one that's just a part of the cycle of life. And this is human beings being a part of the cycle of life. Now, we were taking from the land, but we were sending it all back to England. We were taking from the ground and giving it all away, including our identity. Here, let me, a British citizen, take from your land and give it to someone else in a completely selfish sort of stealing way, and not giving ourselves back to the land. And it's not just digging a hole and putting a fish in it and growing corn. It's us. We have to give ourselves outright to the land. And so in the poem, Such as We Were, we gave ourselves outright to the land. And then he describes the land, vaguely realizing westward. We'll get to that in just a moment. But the statement in the middle of it, the parenthetical note that I skipped for you a second ago, was the deed of gift. So the way we gave ourselves, the deed of gift, was many deeds of war, not just one. And the point here isn't that we won the war and therefore we were able to separate from England. The point is that we died in the war. We buried our dead in the ground. And then we would say, this is my home. This is now where I live. So we gave ourselves outright. The deed of gift was many deeds of war. The deed of gift being the thing that we're offering as a title. I'm signing over the rights to my life now. The deed of gift was many deeds of war, and that's the irony he's creating with the language. But anyway, to the land. So we gave ourselves to the land, and the land and we, it's ambiguous, are vaguely realizing westward. So, one step at a time, we occupy not just the East Coast, but the Louisiana Purchase, and then on to the West Coast eventually, all the way to California. But still, so it says, to the land vaguely realizing westward. But still, and the land itself doesn't have the identity that it has for us. Now, that doesn't mean that our identity of it is powerful and that the identity it had when the indigenous people who were here were present was unimportant. It has nothing to do with that. The poem isn't even saying it became better when we occupied it. There's significant ambiguity about how to take the end of the poem, positively or negatively. And the end of the poem is, though, that we gave ourselves to the land vaguely realizing westward, but still unstoried, artless, unenhanced, such as she was, such as she would become. We gave ourselves to the land not knowing what it would become, not knowing the stories that would fill it. The stories are sometimes horrendous, brutal, and the stories are sometimes beautiful, artful. He uses all of that language to be able to say, whatever it became, whatever we identify with it, the reality is that's what became our identity. We identified ourselves with the land because we started burying our dead in the land. We started occupying it in the cycle of life that participates in a land like this. So such as she would, such as she would become, such as she was, such as she would become. The such as she was empty, and the wilderness and the wanderings of Lewis and Clark and everything afterwards. But the such as she would become is the ambiguous language. Beautiful, polluted, I don't know, which way does he mean it? That's the point. It doesn't matter which way he means it. Whatever it is, that's what we've given ourselves to, and this is how we understand who we are now. Now, that's the reason I chose the poem, because of two lines in it. Number one, because of what it says about Massachusetts and Virginia, which we'll bring up in just a moment. Number two, because of the closing, such as she was, such as she would become. Knowing we didn't know what all the stories would be when we committed ourselves to it. And yet here we are, as the occupants of this land, no, more than that, the citizens of this land, the people who identify ourselves with it. And again, regardless of the competition for it, regardless of thinking, do we have a right to it? Should we have done what we did? Did we participate in genocides? And all the legitimate moral questions that go with the background of the establishment of the Americas, and specifically of the United States of America. All those legitimate discussions that ought to be had and that we always ought to consider. The reality is, this is how we identify ourselves. We are Americans because we think of the land that possesses us now. So how does that play into what I want to talk about today? Well, let me start by describing my experience among white evangelicals. And my experience from the time I was young until now, right? And I'm hardly young now. So my experience among white evangelicals, not to say this is what happened to everyone, but I've read enough historical books about this period of time, which is weird when you start reading histories about your own life, written by people who weren't even alive when the things were happening during your life. And then you realize who's a good historian and who's not, because you know who gets it and who doesn't, because you were there. That's a really powerful feeling. Anyway, but it's also a little frightening. But the point is, I've read enough histories about the whole period to know that my experience is certainly not unique. It may not be ubiquitous, and it may not be universal, but it is common. It's not surprising to most people to say what I'm about to say. And all of that, I think, can illuminate for us a better way of understanding who we're dealing with in the rest of the country. One of the things I want to do in the next, I don't know, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 episodes, not promising to do it immediately. I'm working on it. But one of the things I want to do is just respond almost like a question and answer, although the questions have come to me over a period of years, not just in a Sunday night Q&A session with the church or something. But to answer questions about what I think, people understand. They get the terms. They know what they're talking about, and they're not foolish or naive about it, but they don't really get the details of what's going on. It's been so, and I always use the word caricatured. What I really want to use is the word posterized. It's been so posterized. For those of you who do any photography or do any work with art or anything like that, you know what I mean by that. The color depth has been taken out, and these blotches of just solid colors have replaced really nuanced, fine shading and all that kind of stuff, so that you end up with these posterized versions of reality. And that's, I think, where a lot of our thinking on some fairly complex issues actually is. You're either a Republican or a Democrat, and that's it. And it's black and white in that case, not even highly posterized, it's just black and white, period. But the reality is it's much more nuanced than that. And the shades of color within each of those groups and the space between the groups has fine detail to it that most of us, first of all, don't have time to wrestle with and figure out. And a lot of us just don't bother to look at with any detail. And so I want to address that on a bunch of different issues, some political, some not political at all, some theological, some philosophical, whatever. But I think to sort of find the finer lines that exist in those areas, looking forward to those conversations. In the process of running toward that, I came first upon the reality that the thing that we've posterized are the divisions in our culture, the divisions specifically in our country, and I am thinking of this as an American specifically. And what helps me get to explain or help you understand, hopefully, where I'm coming from, is what I mean by that, is to describe my experience among white evangelicals over the last almost 50 years. So I'll start in 1979. When I was 16 years old, in 1979, is when I got serious about God. I got serious about my Christianity, and I got serious about my engagement with other people and what I was going to do with my life and career and so on like that, because I was called to ministry, for one thing, but also because I really committed to a group of people, a church, and got involved with them and the things that they were doing. And so, and I've mentioned to you before, it was a fundamentalist group, and very, very conservative Baptist fundamentalist, completely independent, capital I independent Baptist church is how we would refer to it. We weren't part of some organization of independent Baptist churches like they even understood what independent meant. Anyway, that's how we kind of thought of it. That environment was great for me in some ways, and I'll always be grateful for that. In other ways, it made me think in this posterized way, in this very caricaturing way about who the enemy was and what they thought and how the world was divided and so on. And so I can describe for you, how that sort of played out. Yeah, and I think you'll know, if you've listened to any other episodes, I think you'll know that before I get to the end of that period of time in 2016, my opinions and attitudes had already started to change. I was already around other people who I realized were smarter than I was and knew things and the details and the nuances of difference that I didn't know. And so I had already started to change my mind in some ways, but I was still just swimming in the world of those same white evangelicals. And so I got to see how this was unfolding, even though I wasn't fully in the stream of it by that point. So what I saw was this. From 1979, right up until 2016, so we're talking, 37 years or so, there was and generally I can sort of approve of this, an assumption of almost monolithic agreement about key issues that were going on, and especially on the issues of abortion and homosexuality. There were a few other issues that were really important to people, but they didn't rise anywhere near to the level of abortion and homosexuality. Again, I'm describing my experience among white evangelicals. Those were the things everyone was going to talk about. Those were the things you could use to measure whether you were succeeding in public policy, whether you were getting your point across, whether the whole culture was going to decline and ride in a basket all the way down to the gates of Hades. It was that kind of threat. And so it was absolutely monolithic agreement. If you didn't agree on the issue, there were two possibilities. One, that you were so immature in your faith that we needed to school you so that you could learn the right opinion to have about those issues, or you were just not right with God. You just couldn't actually be a Christian. You must not actually believe the things that you say you believe. That's how we thought about it. Again, I don't think that way now. I haven't changed my mind on the issues. The issues are the same. But what I have changed my mind on is how other people think about the issues and what it means for them to think about those issues in that way. But anyway, we also repeatedly, consistently made head nods, at least, in my tradition, my particular tradition, towards religious liberty. And I appreciate that. I think most of the people I was around would still be in that camp. I don't see any of my old friends, even from 40 years ago, falling into the Christian nationalist camp or something like that. The religious liberty idea is just too valuable in that setting. But it wasn't a major voting issue. It wasn't like something we were attending rallies for or having protests about. And we did do that regarding abortion, for instance. So 1979 to 2016, there were a host of other issues that other people might identify with, but those two were the big ones. So abortion and homosexuality. And then, again, head nods toward religious liberty. And there was very little acknowledgement of any room for diversity on those issues whatsoever. 2016 comes, and, I think most people will identify that with Trump's run for president, Donald Trump's first run for president. And that certainly is a benchmark, a bookmark, I guess I should say, for identifying that year and remembering when this all transpired. But, we should all remember, it's not like Donald Trump emerges and suddenly leads hundreds of millions of people to think something they didn't think before. He is the head of a political movement that was happening in the culture regardless. The Tea Party had emerged. Some of the more radical conservative perspectives had already arisen. There were already pushes in every policy direction that's come up since 2016. There were already pushes in that direction. It just didn't achieve the celebrity status or the successful political status that it achieved under the leadership of Donald Trump. So in 2016, something happened, and we started to shift alliances, because a lot of us were troubled. I was a never-Trumper at the time and all that kind of stuff. Then I haven't really changed my mind about any of those issues, but I have changed my mind about how vociferous or how partisan I need to be in describing it or even understanding where people are coming from. But there was, in the time between 2016 and now, this growing recognition that there's more than one social or political opinion among believers who might share very similar commitments to Christ, who might have very similar commitments to all of the doctrines that we embrace as believers. And it was that year, around 2016, and I couldn't swear whether it was then or 2017, but somewhere right around that period, and this is how I began to encounter this unfolding. And it's weird. This is 9 years ago now. So for people who've only lived in the environment we've been in since 2016, this may sound weird to you. It just may not make sense to you if you have emerged as a person who's politically conscious from the time of 2016 to 2025. But, before that, it was so monolithic, and the assumptions, if you disagreed about the inadequacy of your spirituality or your understanding of biblical truth, it was so powerful that you just kept your head down if you disagreed. You just didn't say it. There were always people there who didn't think it, but they just didn't say it. They knew how to avoid getting into conflict about things. And so that began to emerge for me as something I realized was more significant than I thought. That is, that there actually were differences of opinion, that it wasn't as monolithic as I thought it was. When we finished one night at the church that I attended at the time, and I'm still there, Lake Highlands Baptist Church, a friend of mine came to me after a Bible study, after a journey group meeting that we used to call them journey groups. And he was just being friendly. It wasn't some crisis. This was not like, I need therapy kind of thing. It was just a, friendly conversation. But he said, hey, can we talk outside? And it needed to be a secret. It was like, hushed tones. And I don't want everybody else to hear this, but I kind of want to talk to you for a second and just ask you a question. And so we went outside. I'm like, yeah, sure, we'll go outside and talk. And a lot of politics had come up during the class, but, I was used to all that stuff. And there was, a little bit of disagreement that came up in the class, maybe for one of the first times. Nothing significant, though. Everybody was friendly. Everybody went home peacefully. But after the meeting, and he said, hey, can we go outside and talk for a second? He whispered to me as if he were saying, I'm thinking of leaving my wife, or, I'm not sure I actually believe in God anymore. He didn't say any of that. Nothing like that. Nothing even remotely like that. What he said was, in hushed tones, as if he were saying one of those things, I didn't vote for Trump, and I don't know what people would think if they found out that was the case. He was so intimidated by the prospect of being that outsider who hadn't voted the way that he thought the pressure of the group was putting him under, that he didn't even know what to do about it. Could I even say this out loud to other people? And so he was testing the waters with me, because by then I had put out enough material, done enough episodes, had enough conversations that he knew I hadn't voted for Trump either. And so he knew it was a safe place for him to at least ask the question. I'm not bringing that up because that's the case now. I don't think that's the case now. I think what's happened in churches since then, not all, but in a lot of churches since then, is that people have recognized that we may have very strong opinions, may have the same opinions that we had in 2014, may have the same opinions about who we vote for, but we're also very much more strongly inclined to acknowledge that there are probably people who disagree with us, not because they're spiritually inadequate, but because we haven't persuaded them politically yet, or they haven't come to our side, or maybe there's room for difference on those political issues. And suddenly we realize that there actually is room for more than one social and political opinion among believers who actually have the same commitment to doctrines and the things that they hold. Now, the reason I bring that up is not to talk about churches and how they have those different opinions inside of them, or how you ought to manage the differences of political opinions that are in your congregation. There are congregations that struggle with that, and that would be a conversation worth having on another day. But to talk about us as a country, us as a society, and the differences that are among us, with an awareness that it's not as simple as the black and white that a lot of us paint it with, and a lot of us have painted it with historically. So the categories from the poem kind of help make the distinction. And one of the things I think that Robert Frost is implying in the poem, whether he intended to or not, he did. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's just part of the reality of American history. Anyone who talks about American history recognizes that there is a huge difference between the motivations of the Plymouth plantation. That line in the poem is in Massachusetts, in Virginia, as we were finding our identity, in America before we belonged to the continent. Well, the establishment of those colonies, the establishment of those permanent settlements, especially Plymouth Plantation and Jamestown, they become these bookmarks for the differences in American culture that persist down to this day, particularly the Puritan religious kind of culture. We're going to establish a Plymouth Plantation on the basis that we're going to be free of the religious oppression that we faced in England and so on. And, the fact that you have to have other struggles, subsequent struggles, to maintain ideas of actual religious liberty, like what Roger Williams goes through later, doesn't change the fact that it's based on religious ideology. We're coming here because of our beliefs. We want to be able to build up a society on our Christian beliefs and so on, and not have it threatened by the king or something like that. So in Massachusetts, that's what's going on. In Virginia, which is established before Massachusetts, as if I remember my history correctly, about 13 or 15 years, something like that, before Plymouth Plantation. When Jamestown, Virginia is established, it's a mercantile economy. It's established so that people can hunt for gold, so that they can find, trap animals and collect furs and sell all the goods back in England and make money. It is mercantile. It is economic. That doesn't mean there are no religious people there. It doesn't mean there are no religious implications. There are some evidences of some pretty secular ideas going on, and even a few little pagan-type rituals going on in the Virginia area at the time, maypoles and stuff like that. Anyway, the point is, I'm saying, you have this very significant ideological divide, even in the founding of the country. And again, I know I'm putting it simplistically, but it's not wrong in the way we understand the background of our country and that divide. From the founding of the country until the present day, some strong, visible lines dividing our people sociologically, philosophically, and religiously have been persistent. And the Puritan origins of Plymouth Plantation, the economic, secular, pragmatic influences of Jamestown are part of that. The fact that they manifest in the letters back and forth between John Adams from Massachusetts, Braintree, Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson from Virginia. The fact that Thomas Jefferson is so much more pragmatic, deistic in his way of understanding the nature of even religious influence in the world, the fact that you can see that contrast with John Adams, devotionally Christian, overtly and devotionally Christian in his commitments, is just part of carrying forward that divide in the country. And that's how we tend to, or certainly would like to, think of the divisions in our society right down to this day. It's really convenient to do that. And I've heard those kind of characterizations repeatedly, again, right down to the present day. And I've certainly heard as much from conservatives and Republicans characterizing progressives and Democrats. Why, those, Democrats, they don't even believe in God. It's part of their platform that God can't exist, and so on. And again, I'm not saying there's no grounding in it. The division in the country was real. But the idea that everybody who votes Democrat or participates in some of the Democratic process, in opposition to Republican process, must be an atheist who hates God and hates religion and hates everything about it and is trying to create a pagan secular world, that's it's just patently false. It's just not true. You can disagree with them, and you can even believe they're absolutely and adamantly wrong and that they align with that ideology. But the fact that they actually hold that ideology is just flat false. And it's false going the opposite direction, too, for those who think that everyone who votes for a Republican must be going to church on Sunday morning and singing patriotic hymns to the American flag overflown by a cross, something like that. That's a mischaracterization as well. The problem, what I was saying earlier, is the same thing. The problem is that the characterizations are flat. They're inaccurate. They're susceptible. And this is the worst part of it, and we do this all the time. They're susceptible to the no true Scotsman fallacy. In fact, I did that, the question-begging fallacy, the no true Scotsman fallacy, in a whole episode one time, because we're so bad about presuming that someone who's on the other side must think that way, and the evidence that they must think that way isn't that they actually say the words or that they agree with the ideology, but that they don't agree with us about the only way they could actually be right. There are plenty, and let me just clarify this. There are plenty, and I don't mean just a measurable percentage like, well, there's at least 3%. I mean, there are plenty of progressives and Democrats completely committed to every doctrinal test we can put up for what it means to be a believer and a follower of Christ. I know them. I know some of them. And there are whole churches filled with people who absolutely committed to every single doctrine we would identify as being essential to Christianity or even important to Christianity, who vote the opposite way than you do or than I do. So I've always found it funny when I'm sitting in a room of conservatives, and I've seen this quite a few times. I always find it funny when I'm sitting in a room of conservatives, when the evangelicals in the room come to realize that their church language is out of place there. They're so used to being, and I'm not making fun of them. I just think it's funny when it happens, because it's like, they don't say that here. Because they're so used to being in a Bible study group and then talking about these things, talking about these political issues or talking about who they're going to vote for or whatever's going to happen, that they get in a room full of political conservatives and they just start using the language. Well, amen, and stuff, and whatever the word is that comes out. And then everybody stares at them and they go, oh yeah. We're not in agreement because we're Christian. We're in agreement because of some political issue that's different than that. And it's a really funny thing when they realize some of the people in the room are actually quite antithetical in their views to the things that they believe about Christianity. That is, they act, and so what they come to realize, and sometimes this is the way it plays out, that what they come to realize is that they actually have more affinity with people who agree with them about a particular political issue than they do with some people who don't agree with them about those political issues, but actually would agree with them that Jesus is Lord. And that's a really weird thing, isn't it? But it is, and we all know this. We all know the surveys over the last 10 years that have pointed this out, and our own experience. I mean, this is phenomenologically consistent. Everywhere I've gone, I've seen that this is the case, that we are much more inclined to recognize the affinity we have with people who agree with us philosophically and politically than we are to recognize the commonality we have with people who agree with us theologically and religiously, and specifically in our commitment to Christ. You can agree completely on the resurrection of Christ and the nature of salvation and the eternity of the church and blah, blah, blah. And if they vote the wrong way, say, I'm not really at home at this church here. This doesn't quite feel right to me. We all know that's been the case. And I know that the typical response to that, or at least one I've heard commonly, is that, well, look, you say it's because of a political difference or something like that, but the truth is they can't really believe Jesus is Lord if they're willing to defend abortion rights. Or they can't really believe Jesus is Lord if they are willing to accept the government's current approval of homosexual marriage. And what we don't realize is that if we say things like that, we are falling prey to the no true Scotsman's fallacy. You understand the fallacy I'm talking about. You can go back and listen to the other episode, but just briefly put, it's when you say, no true Scotsman would put sugar on his porridge. Porridge, that's the right word, right? Sometimes I use the wrong word. Okay, so porridge. So no true Scotsman would do that. Well, my Uncle Angus, this is the traditional example. He puts sugar on his porridge, and he's obviously Scottish. I mean, his name is Uncle Angus. Give me a break. But the response is, well, not if he puts sugar on he's no true Scotsman would do that. He must not actually be Scottish. The absurdity of it is that it's begging the question. It's saying the test is whether you put sugar on your porridge, and then the consequent is that you are or aren't a Scotsman. But you have to assume that you're correct for your test to be valid. If you're not correct, if there's a single Scotsman that does put sugar on his porridge, you'd be wrong, but you couldn't find that out because you've already decided that the definition is in the fact that they don't put sugar on their porridge. It's the same thing here. Well, no true Christian could vote for a pro-choice candidate. That couldn't possibly happen. Well, I believe in Jesus. This is not true about me. That is true about me, obviously. But I am saying I can occupy the place of a person. Let me just impersonate someone and say, I can find people who would say these exact words and mean it, and they live it. I believe in Jesus. I believe in the resurrection. He is my Lord. I study the scriptures every day. All I want to do is be faithful to what Jesus has called me to do, and I voted for a pro-choice candidate. You can say, well, then you're obviously not following Jesus or don't understand the truth or something like that. You can say that, but you're committing the no true Scotsman's fallacy. You're assuming that because they disagree with you on some subsequent cause, they must not be able to agree with you on the thing they actually do agree with you about, which is the lordship of Jesus and the resurrection. That doesn't even mean they're right. It doesn't mean I'm saying you have to choose to acknowledge that their opinion on that issue is just as valid as everybody else's opinion on the issue. Sometimes things are right and sometimes things are wrong, but they don't determine whether you're a believer or not. They don't determine whether you're a Christian or not, nor do they determine whether you're an American or not, as it turns out. So the point is that there are a lot more fault lines than just one along which political interests divide themselves. It's just not the case that there's one great continental divide in the Americas, and it's the line between the Republicans and Democrats. And if a raindrop falls on this side, it's going to flow down to the Democrat Ocean. And if it falls on that side, it will flow to the Mississippi Republican River. That's just not the truth. We have a lot of fault lines in our culture that divide people politically and ideologically. So, like, for instance, if you tried to divide the whole country between the religious and the secular, the reality is that on the religious side, you have demographic fault lines between evangelicals and mainlines, between white churches and black churches, between Catholics and Protestants. Politically, you have lines of division between those who love religious liberty, and I believe understand it because I value it tremendously, and those who are advocating for something like Christian nationalism, which is not consistent with religious liberty, in my opinion, on this side of the fault line, as it turns out. There are all kinds of divisions among those who are religious, and there are all kinds of fault lines on the secular side as well. There are secularists who are economic conservatives and those who are economic progressives. There are angry anti-theologues on the secular side, and there are paternalistic religious patrons on the secular side. Among the secular, by the way, there are those who see religion as a disease, literally describe it that way, and then there are those who see it as an ally. We should work together and get somewhere. There are differences of opinion on the political issues, the ideological issues, the sociological issues, all of those on each side of the religious-secular divide, and that's not even the only way you can divide things. And additionally, there are other divisions where religious and secular ideas are irrelevant. Like it won't even come up. Are you religious or are you secular? And by the way, that's a lot. This is just the opposite of what I was saying about fracture lines. There are a lot more than just two sides within which alliances form. Alliances form along all kinds of affinities. I always use Rotary clubs as the explanation of this. It's just the reality that people, when they're in those organizations, I see the weirdest things. I see people who will stand up in their pulpit and preach like they believe everyone who disagrees with their church should be murdered. And I know you think I'm exaggerating, but just think back over the people who have said, we ought to put them all in a pen and drop a nuclear weapon on them. So I know it sounds absurd, but I'm describing what they say. I'm not saying they would do it. I've seen those same people walk into a Rotary Club meeting or, whatever they're called, the Commerce Club type meetings in cities, and act like everything's cool, because what really matters is that we're able to sit down and have a conversation and build a stable society. I don't know what I think about that. I don't know if I'm seeing hypocrisy or if I'm just seeing the grateful acknowledgement that civility requires a recognition that we share affinities and divisions across so many different lines that we have to quit thinking there's my team and then there's that enemy team, and that's all there is. There are so many differences and so many affinities. They're all worth recognizing. So the affinities, of management on one side and labor on the other, or of libertarians on one side, solve your own problems, or paternalists on the other side, the government owes it to help everybody who's impoverished. Whichever side you happen to be on, those do not divide themselves religiously and secularly, for instance. They don't divide themselves conveniently between people who live in wealthy neighborhoods and people who live in poor neighborhoods, or between people who are white and people who are black. It just doesn't happen that way. The reality is there are fault lines all over the place, and there are affinity groups all over the place, and they're different and intersecting and in multiple ways experiencing all of that. Okay, so all of that said, what's the point I'm trying to get to? So ultimately, we just have to recognize that the divisions and coalitions among us will always invite conflict. They're always going to be there. But they will also always be shifting. So if you make your conflicts absolute and deadly, then you're missing out on the coalition that was coming around the corner, or on observing or recognizing the fault lines that were about to divide you from someone you just hooked yourself to at the hip. That means, and I think this is the whole point, this is why I read that poem to you at the beginning, that means we have to find a different ground, literally, of commonality. And I do mean literally, a different ground of commonality. And I hope you'll get why I'm saying this. It's not just, let's all sing Kumbaya over the canyon, and everything will be fine. Among believers, a ground of commonality is obvious. The resurrection of Jesus, the fact that he came out of the ground, right? So no problem with that. But even including believers, but among the whole of a society, and in this case, I'm specifically talking about American society, American culture, there has to be some other way we think of unity or commonality. We don't require everybody to be a Christian, and not everybody's going to be a Christian even if we require it. It's just not going to happen. So what are we going to do? Pretend they don't exist or kill them all if they disagree with us? Those don't seem like the best options, right? Please tell me you agree those don't seem like the best options. Well, then what are we supposed to do? Well, think about how long simmering the opposition to so affirmative action, for instance, has been. And why do I raise this? Because we're always going to have boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable behavior. We're always going to establish policies. We're going to create laws. We're not just going to say, those are the murderers, and they get along with each other, so we're going to let them have some hand in defining policy about whether murder is acceptable or not. Murder is not going to be acceptable. We have some basic rules that we're going to lay down that we're going to have to live by, and some of those are going to be controversial. So thinking of affirmative action, I'm saying, think about it in terms of saying not just, let's make it happen, let's do it, but recognizing that when we have done it, there is still going to be the presence of all of the people who hated that we did it. They're still going to live in the land with us. They're still a part of the country that we're a part of. And if you think about how long simmering the opposition to that specific action has been, that now, we're talking 50 and 60 years later, we're getting edicts from the current administration to try to undermine the whole process of affirmative action in higher education, at least, then you can see how fruitless it is. And I'm in favor of affirmative action, so I have no problem with it whatsoever. I'm glad it was passed as a law. Again, not saying we can't do things. I'm saying we need to think differently about the people who disagree with us about those things. When you see the opposition rising up now, we should also recognize that if we are seeing that opposition to our ideology or the things we value, if we only see them as an enemy to be crushed under the boot of some political victory that we've had, it's an invitation to catastrophe. It's an invitation practically to civil war. I don't mean that in the next decade or something like that, but I do mean it's an invitation to all kinds of catastrophes. It doesn't make this recognition that I'm begging us to have doesn't make any of these problems easy to solve. I'm not saying, everything would be better if we would just see this. But it does mean we can at least start looking for a way back to civil discourse, which entails civil discourse at a table with people who disagree with us about some of the most fundamental things in our mind that are important. And I mean that on both sides. I do mean it on both sides. I didn't always, but I do mean it on both sides. If we realize what Frost's poem is saying, is that what actually makes us a people is the land. What makes us a people is that we occupy this land together, and that's how we identify. It's not that distinct from the way Old Testament Israel understood the importance of the land that they were able to settle in after 40 years in the wilderness. When you read the end of Joshua, and I won't take time to read this because I've run out of time, but I don't want to go on and on and on. But you go read the last 5-6 verses of the book of Joshua. They're all about burying people. It's just burying people. So Joshua dies and he's buried in this place in his own inheritance in Timnath-Serah. And let me just remind you, we brought the bones of Joseph out of Egypt and we buried them in the place that had been provided at Shechem. And then Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died and they buried him at Gibeon, the town of Phinehas' son, blah, blah, blah. That's the end of the book. That's the end. The end of this great book of conquest and struggle and trial and so on. It's just about burying them in the land. Why is that so important? For the same reason it's important to us. Our fathers and brothers and mothers and sisters and aunts and grandparents and great-grandparents and people who fought for us in wars and people who loved us and agreed with us and people who hated us and fought against us, they're buried in the same land we live in. That's our land. And we share it with all of them and their ancestors and the people who followed after them. We share it with them. I'm not pretending this whole discussion resolves or even addresses all the persistent and, in some ways, proliferating problems that are among us. But at least it can give us the prospect of a common ground where we meet and begin to see the people who share our roads and our groceries and our livelihoods as part of us. Not part of some strange outside evil influence obstructing our enjoyment of all that is good if we could just get rid of them, but a part of us, in common with us, because that's exactly what they are, exactly what we are.
Thanks for joining us for Coffee with Creamer. Your cup of coffee may be finished, but we are not. Come back next week for a refill as we sit down to examine a new set of ideas and cultural issues. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or visit our website at barrycreamer.com. Until next time, keep your mug hot and your mind sharp.